the Contact Festival Dartington, and this is a conference by the Dance Studies Department at the University of Malta. I'm very grateful for Ellie for helping to film, and so hopefully we can get these videos also made available for other people who can't. So it's wonderful to see the chairs filled. Our focus is thinking touch, artistic, philosophical, and scientific perspectives in contact improvisation and partnering. And we've invited 2 keynotes. We'll have one in the morning and one in the afternoon. You have a schedule within your conference pack, so you can see we're running a little bit late due to some technical setup, but we should finish around 10. Coffee, we will have 2 coffee breaks. One, we can go upstairs to Sergio's, and everybody can get a hot drink as part of the conference, and then also once in the afternoon. So, first off, I'm very happy and pleased to welcome Lucia Walker as our first keynote. And I'll just introduce you a bit. You will see in your sheet you have in your conference pack you have a sheet with quotes on it, which is going to relate to Lucia's talk. Lucia is an independent artist and pedagogue based in Oxford, England, and Durban, South Africa. She travels and teaches internationally, exploring a lifelong delight in movement and communication. She was introduced to contact improvisation in 1985, studying with Steve Paxton, Nancy Stark-Smith, Julyen, Hamilton, and Kirstie Simson. She's been learning, teaching, and practicing the form ever since. Lucia worked for many years with Jointwork DanceGroup, working with schools and community groups. Besides choreography, Jointwork focused on exploring improvised performance, and Lucia has continued this research with Telling Times International Theatre Project. She continues to work in many contexts, leading workshops in collaborative dance, physical theatre, communication, and research projects. She's also a teacher of the Alexander technique, and this is going to be featuring her. So thank you very much, Lucia, for joining me.
Convention that you get clapped before you start with talks. Just for the evening. So the title of Malika invited me to give a talk which had something from the workshop I gave, and then I changed the title. The title comes from a poem which is there in your pack, and I'll tell you later. You don't need to look at it now. But what I'm talking about is a thing that sort of continues actually more and more to fascinate me, which is what is called, well, we call in the Alexander world conscious inhibition, to distinguish it from neurophysiological inhibition, which is the programs really that stop things happening, which are as vital as things that need to start happening. And I think I'll introduce a little bit about what you all know what contact is, and some of you know quite a lot about Alexander technique. But I'll say a little bit about that because it's not, maybe people don't. And it's a modality where we use touch a lot in the teaching. And I started Alexander technique or training as a teacher pretty close into when I started contact improvisation. So I have to say that in my own interests and self-work, I don't quite know what came from where with some of it. So there's sort of different worlds and there's a different emphasis in those worlds, but for my interests, they're really closely connected. Just thought about it. Yes, and I've been teaching both of them and found that this focus of how not to do things is kind of key in both, or key in the learning and discovery of both dancing and touch, and teaching by touch, and touching in various contexts, Alexander and other. But I'll just read a couple of, because there's, like contact, there's a great discussion about how to define Alexander technique, which is named after a guy, Alexander, who lived in the turn of the last century, so 1890 to 1950, that kind of time. And specific skills that Alexander technique teaches is how to pay attention to how we move, respond, and think. So it's a kind of bringing awareness to what Alexander called it the study of human reaction. So how we respond to stuff, internally and externally. And we gain awareness of our existing conditions and study them in operation. We learn how to notice habitual patterns of thought and movement that play a part in physical discomfort or the interference with performance and everyday tasks or specialized skills. We learn what to do based on these insights and how to replace habitual action with an intentional, attentional process. So the last phrase, this is actually one that someone else wrote, applying the technique helps to develop conscious interaction with the environment as we move in three-dimensional space and time. So it's kind of being, how to be and how to do stuff when we be. In Contact, it's like, as my personal way of describing it to people when I come to dancers or people, what's different from other movement forms is that it's from the inside out. So is Alexander, looking at your own experience of being in the physics of the world and in relationship and those things. For me, that's what Contact's about. What's it like to be moving, falling in resistance, physics in our own experience. And it comes from that, it doesn't come in the normal way that many movement forms do from what we see or learn as a shape. Yeah, I think that's enough in terms of those general things. The inhibitory thing, just before that, I'm going to ask you, don't change anything well, you can stop if you're doing something, but don't change your position for a minute and just close your eyelids. Don't change your position. You can. Change it. And just notice what you notice. And in my experience, normally when we first notice, or the first layer of noticing, which usually goes behind a conscious level, is anything that's actually a little bit uncomfortable, pain definitely, but slight discomfort, a little wish arising that you hadn't been exactly there. If there's something that's really extremely uncomfortable or going to be tiring, like yours, Vanya, let it change. But otherwise, just stay where you are. If it's a hand gesture you want to release. And I'm going to suggest a couple of things to notice while you're there, which will be effortless. We talked about that in class the other day, that the word goes in the brain and then you notice it. So notice where you're touching the chair and the floor, that sense of pressure that lets you know you're supported. And then let yourself notice other aspects of touch, pressure, where you're touching yourself, the objects, pens and papers, your skin on your clothes, your hair maybe. Notice it. And allow yourself to notice the movement, pretty slight, that's going on as you sit there. We did small dance yesterday. Sitting, there's less movement, but there's a movement of breath within the torso. You can notice. Allow yourself to notice your proprioception at that very basic spatial level, the position you are in, what you could draw, probably the angle of your fingers, head, knees to each other. Touch is part of this, so you'll know what you're touching and where you are from touching. And last one, which is less of a awareness than a visualization, which for most of us, I'm sure for all of you, you have an internal picture or a map of your spine, which is going more or less from where you're touching the chair to more or less behind your nose, long curves. And the head is poised on top of that, moving to be poised, but because we're still, you probably can't feel that movement. Just take the tiniest movement you can feel of your head, a nod and a shake on the top of the spine. Smallest movement you can feel. And then allow yourself, from wherever you are, to first of all just let it in as an idea, don't do anything directly, and then allow yourself to move in the direction that would give you a slightly more easy support from the chair or the floor, slightly more space for your breathing and all the other organic functions that are happening. Yeah, some of the movements might be quite big. Let yourself move to them. And that allows for the length and slightly easy movement of the head. Maybe you want to do a slightly more pedestrian movement of the head, nodding, turning. Notice if anything else is more or less noticeable in this place. And so your eyelids. Look around and see the change. And just, well, I find it quite interesting that in a way, I talked about this, we put ourselves for verbal things on a kind of park where we don't actually look after, as movers, the stuff that goes on unconsciously. It's really typical. It's sort of, okay, I'm not moving or dancing, I'll kind of put it to sleep. And then it's actually quite hard for the brain functions and everything else. So it's an invitation, really, as things go on, to just keep some attention with yourself. That you can have that, and that will support your attention to all the speaking, being. Just any comments, complaints, or questions just about that, and we'll talk through.
And I also, when I close my eyes and I concentrate, I feel sad. I also feel an emotion, because I think I close my eyes and I feel something internal. I also have sort of emotion. It's not only feeling the body, it's also feeling.
Absolutely, and especially, I mean, I didn't go into it, it would be too long in that, but as soon as you become aware, you notice all the stuff that's going on, and emotion is definitely one of it, part of it. I think it's not so much closing the eyes, it's just going, how am I? How am I? Oh, there's some sand there, there usually is somewhere.
I feel a little bit grateful just being invited to feel my body. It's like going through the thing was like, oh wait a minute, let's go about feeling the body for a moment.
And the same, sort of remember you can do that any time, and visually, there's, I don't know whether this is part of the inhibitory thing for me, but the habitual way, habitual and learnt are both things that rule us somewhat. So this practice of going, okay, can I stop what comes automatically? Not because it's bad, some of it is very necessary, but some of it is not appropriate to the moment. You know that. It was learnt or was a habit for something else. And one of mine, definitely, I consider a little bit, is a visual grasping. particularly when there's any intellectual or that kind of activity, there's a way where the eyes want to take it. So that's another thing, just thinking that actually your visual cortex is way back, in the back of your head. The eyes don't have to do that work, they can just move and let it in, and you can still breathe. There's also a challenge for many of us. Stillness is a challenge, because we're not getting the feedback we're used to. But there is always feedback. There's always that support feedback, pressure, touch feedback, that you can just include as you're going along. So I am going to read one of the quotes you don't have, which is actually from neither Alexander nor the contact things, which I was looking at for me, but it's from a woman called Marion Milner, who was became a therapist when she wrote this book called A Life of One's Own. She was a middle-class woman in London in the 1930s or so, who wondered why she was so seldom happy. She had a kind of nice life, went to concerts, did things, and she started researching her experience to find out why she was seldom happy. This had a little bit of parallel with Alexander, as I said, the guy, the Alexander techniques named after, who was an actor who lost his voice. And when he went to doctors and things, they said, we can't find anything wrong. So he thought, okay, I must be doing something to interfere with this process of acting, which was his thing. So he researched his behavior, his action, to see what was he doing that was causing the constriction, I suppose we'd call it. But anyway, what I love about Marion Milner is she comes to a very nice definition of what I think of as the inhibitory ability. And she goes, certainly, I'd found that my best moments that I counted as successes, had not followed the tooth-gritting keeping of resolutions, which I'd been taught to believe was the only way of getting things done. For the language thing, do you know what tooth-gritting is like? Okay, I'm going to do it. But they did often follow what appeared to be a voluntary act of mine, although the act itself was almost the opposite of my idea of willing. Willing to me meant asserting myself. Well, what appeared to be the significant act here was almost a deliberate negation of self, an active holding back from any form of action, a keeping myself in leash, or a putting something of myself out into the object I looked at, so that for the moment my own will was wiped out. I mean, it's quite strong that putting herself in leash, but for me that's really like something that happens in a contact dance, where my attention is going to the place, or to the gravity, or to the something that is not about my ambition to do stuff. Gradually, I saw more clearly what had been my assumptions about the meaning of trying and willing. Trying was an internal clenching and grunting, which I seem to imagine had a virtue of its own. At long last, I had grasped the idea that the indispensable preliminary to every task which appeared difficult was not a general tensing and contraction, but that the response I hoped for would happen if I just looked in the direction I wanted to go and waited. And I mean, that's also quite strong, the looking in the direction you want to go and waited. But I remember in Scott's class this moment of we're about to work with a partner, curiosity, waking up, working with them, and that invitation to actually just wait a minute before you even do that. It's like we're programmed to go so quickly into action that it's almost done before we've done it. And that was about to happen when I didn't, thankfully, when I told you not to change your position. If we're something like this and someone says, pay attention, we'll go, oh, that's not comfortable. I'll change my position. And we'll change it without needing it to the front of our consciousness. Just finding the Steve Paxton one. For what came to me about contact was this idea that Steve talked about. It's in the transcript of Fall After Newton, of retraining reflexes. Reflexes is a sort of thornier word now about what it actually means, but something about training your system to not be frightened of falling, for instance, because it's learned how to deal with it. And it's just quiet, and that's what the small dance does. This sense of, okay, if I can get to stop the fear pattern of losing balance, which is what I see a lot in early contact learning. It's that this moment actually, as it should, provokes a fear response to rebalance. So we do various things about how can I actually override that fear. I'm calling it fear. It's not quite emotional fear. It's more like physical fear of losing balance. How can I put in a space so that we don't have that, so that I can be awake at the moment of falling, for instance. The same about tightening. I think that's what the... I put him away again. The specific thing of not tightening when you fall. How do we learn that? Well, observing the constant adjustments the body makes to keep from falling, that's in the subtle, calms the whole being. It is watching the reflexes at work, knowing they're subtle and dependable, not just emergency measures. And then we do something very similar to that in Alexander work. It's like we can't feel ourselves at a certain level when we're just balancing. Well, that intrigues me about the head on the neck. You can't feel it moving, but it's moving. If you fall asleep, it'll fall off. Something in there is moving to keep it poised. I like this bit. The support needed from the unconscious, reflexive parts of the brain is more present when the conscious mind is not afraid. The calmness of standing is extended into the fall. And that's something very, very key in Alexander work, sometimes to an extreme degree, the ability to quieten your system. So that, not so that you stay quiet, but so that you can then go into action with less of the fear. The whole thing of this stopping, though, it's really difficult to find ways, I find, to practice it. And it's so key. I'm just looking at the clock there. I'm going to go. So, do it with my glasses here. You don't really need to look at them now, but I put some of these down. So Alexander says in 1941, in his writing, he, like many of us, was not primarily a writer, speaker. He did his Shakespeare. He was a teacher, practitioner, and his research was very much experiential, as many of us make it. But he goes, inhibition is a human potentiality of utmost value in any attempt to make changes in the human self. And my experience has convinced me that it is the potentiality most in need of development. And there are quite a lot way goes into the more political, the bigger, the smaller. I really agree with that, basically. I think that when we learn and develop the ability by choice to not react is, it's not about speed really, it's about habit, or in a particular rut. When there's that possibility in there, there's much more possibility. And it comes up in dancing. So that, in a way, the game that I did with so separating things out, the sliding, the pressing, the tapping, can you not do one of them? Mostly you can't, but if you can bring in that ability to go, oh, there's another option there. One of the ways of thinking about it that I quite like is just that your nervous system, your predictive brain is on a track if I'm going there, and I can actually, with a thought, open up the other possibilities. I can still keep going with the possibility I'm interested in, but not have the constraining of being sort of on a track. Alexander called that endgame, having your thing. So it's both at a reflex and a chosen level. In relation to touch, when am I finishing? 10.
You got 5 past.
In relation to touch, it's in contact, it's there, and we're doing like Charlie's reference, and I've got that in there, that Kirstie has this exercise game called Hands That Want Nothing. And in a way, I was thinking that one of the, maybe we will have a chance to talk about that, but what I think of as a successful, or what I like when I'm dancing contact, is when I sense that the person I'm dancing with and myself doesn't want a specific thing from me. When there's a kind of freedom, that's like, phew. And I like to see that. And I like to see it in choreography as well, which is interesting. It's something about not just doing the thing, but experiencing the thing you're doing it. That's when I like to see it, when there's not a closing down but an opening up. Something about possibility, potentiality, that I think this refraining from allows. I'm going back to touch, but I'm going to read one other Alexander based, two others. One is a musician who's written a book on Alexander work called Indirect Procedures. He says, call it non-doing, if you like, or neutrality, or emptying before filling, or creating an inner space, or readying the void, or letting go and letting be. Broadly speaking, you can react to any situation from habit or from choice. You might then call inhibition a permanent state of latent choosing. Words are imperfect when it comes to naming something so difficult to grasp. Inhibition isn't a good word, but all other words are imperfect too. So that's it has an association, the word inhibition. I like to use it, and we've added in the conscious part because of its connection into neurophysiology. It's a vital part, but it has an association from Freud with repression. And that's the one but it's actually less strong. Freud's influence has sort of faded a bit, even since the time I'm doing it. I think the neuroscience definition is a bit more frontal. I don't know what it's like for people, what the word inhibition means, but people do still talk about my inhibitions. That means the things that you've repressed, and it's not in that sense. So all those words, refraining from, withholding, pausing. We often, in Alexander work, often use pausing, which is kind of a little problematic because it makes it seem like time's involved. And is it more like making space? And I noticed myself using this gesture quite a lot, and the peripheral vision comes into that for me. So it's sort of like, how do we do all these? And the final part, a lot, is when we're working with touch, particularly with the hands, I notice, and when I'm training teachers in Alexander work, what we're wanting to do is train out any assumption or prejudice is the wrong word, prediction, which is actually needed we need it in our habit. Like if I go to pick something up, and you can do that, my hand will do what is necessary with the vision, with everything to make the shape it's needed, etc. And in moving, the hands that want nothing actually want to put in, I can't remember how to turn to something and touch them, I'll do it in a minute, that they will come with a predictive shape or action or something. Hands particularly, the rest of the body in touch is less specific because the hands are like the focused part of the skill and the whole touch organism. So inhibition comes in then of let me let go of that prediction so that I can be present to what actually is. And I think that's very much the whole body thing for me in contact, that will come prediction, I'm saying also with wish, desire. It's like, I want this. It happened definitely in yours. We found a really strong thing, Susanna and I, in that lifting. For those who weren't here, Charlie was doing we were trying not to lift, actually. But that's the label was on it. It was taking somebody's weight on your hip, and into our brains goes, I'm going to lift them. And into our bodies, even those of us who are fairly experienced at this, will be a pattern that's not quite what's needed. It's a bit more. And in our case, it was this stopping. It's like, oh, I've got to stop. So in this case, the inhibition of that was to not stop. That was how we inhibited that pattern of like, oh, I've got to lift, was to go, okay, let me move right through it. That's also an inhibition for me of the pattern that comes up of like, I've got to pick them up. Or I'm going to be picked up, and there's a slight, well, Charlie's example in that was when we have weight taken, and you really find that with beginners, it comes back to the tone discussion, that when your weight is supported, you either go into a flop response or a slight stop, because as adults it's not a familiar thing to be off the ground. So then we have to learn to inhibit that flop, either the flop or the startle, by staying present to what's happening. And that is in Alexander work and in contact we use with direction, I'd say, with knowing what you do want or a different way of getting it. I want to read one more of the quotes because it also connects. Oh yeah, and I'll read a quote from the eminent Charlie Morrissey. It was withheld. No reference because it was yesterday, but I'm sure you said it. It's again, I've started looking for all the places where people are trying to say this. And he said, don't be so busy with knowing everything that you forget to notice all you don't know. Classic Alexander statement is, I'm not sure, I think it's Alexander, is how can you do, or basically you can't do something you don't know if you keep doing what you do. So you have to stop, at some level you have to withhold the doing everything you know, and yet that's not about withholding the wisdom, the learning. It's a little bit paradoxical because it's not like coming totally new. to something, it's coming practiced. And I suppose what's key for me is that the thing to practice is this withholding in the moment, so that what you need or what's free or what's new and what you've practiced in terms of things working works. Oh yes, it's Frank Pierce-Jones I want to read, because he connects inhibition with attention very clearly. When I concentrated either on myself or on the goal I wanted to reach, something happened outside my field of attention to frustrate my attempt. It was only after I realized attention can be expanded as well as narrowed that I began to note progress. In order to move on a conscious level in which I could be aware of both doing and not doing, of the inhibitory as well as the excitatory part of the movement, I had to expand my attention, and you can do it right now, so that it took in something of myself and something of the environment as well. It was just as easy, I found, instead of setting up two fields, to establish a single integrated field in which both the environment and the self could be viewed simultaneously. And we're doing that all the time in Contact. Sometimes we go, well, it's actually impossible to just pay attention to yourself. But the whole thing of ground, vision, touch, in and out, and it's very, your comment about the emotional thing, it's a balance, a thermostat, which I think has an inhibitory part, that's a really useful tool. For instance, pain and emotional, strong emotional response, I would say take us to what we call inner. But we're concerned with ourselves, that's all there is, when something hurts or when you feel something really powerful. And you can just choose to take in something of the outer environment. The other way around, in this situation where like I'm wanting information, or I'm dancing, or I'm running around being busy, or I'm catching a shuttle, it's like all our attention has gone into the action, and you can include yourself. It's a really nice balance to have. For me, it goes a little bit with the tonal one, of like dropping somewhere or over-exciting somewhere, which is what Frank Pierce-Jones is saying. That balance, what we call internal, external, an integrated field also integrates the hyperactivity, not to a kind of balanced place. I think I don't want to do another whole activity. That's what I'm going to. For me, last thing really, and it's been a sort of sweep through, or to summarise. For me, it's that in Contact dancing and in Alexander teaching, where I work with people who do all sorts of other stuff, classical musicians, classical singers, people who have to do a lot of labouring work, so the attention is more on something else. That this ability to make a space, withhold, choose to become a bit more conscious, is probably how I see inhibition most clearly. It's like just be aware of what's happening, so that you're not ruled by the reflex or habitual. So it doesn't really take anything, but the learning and practicing of it does. That's a very long sentence for some. So yeah, for me it's key, and it's key to the enjoyment. And there are games, so I sort of also suggest or ask you to notice how many ways you try and do that in your teaching or your work. And there are games, there are a few. about not doing stuff that are done for kids, not very many, mostly that are about doing things, and it's quite fun. And it makes a kind of magic. That's what I notice in specifically teaching with touch, which we do in Alexander work, where you're not wanting to do something to a person or repattern them or make them better or anything. You're wanting to reflect them back to themselves, patterns of contact. You're wanting the proprioceptive systems to influence each other, so that the practice of quietening, which a teacher will have practiced, will communicate, or enlivening, whichever is sort of lost. And I think the same happens in contact. As soon as we touch, we actually get the other whole system at some level, a little bit more peripherally than our own, the peripheral vision. But when we get engaged in that, magic happens. You know, it really is. I call it magic just because it sort of doesn't seem to have words or have that usual sequence of cause and effect. And that's why the poem came to mind. It doesn't go so closely with what I was talking about, but for me it goes very closely with the whole theme of your conference. And I did go through it with Maria Bach, because it's, if you're not first language English, it's Emily Dickinson, so it's quite, I don't understand all the words in it. But it's a wonderful poem. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof the gambols of the sky. Of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide of narrow hands to gather paradise. Thank you. Yes, thank you. There's another, and I think I've done it with some of you, inhibition activity, which we can maybe do later if there's a space. Thank you for your attention. And if there, yeah.
Questions or comments?
Questions, comments, or with this group, I'd also invite something you want to articulate, a thought of your own. Sometimes when you go to talks, it's like people use the chance to do that too much. Yeah, yeah, go. Am I an in charge?
It's interesting you said to inhibit your mind, you did the pause exercise. And then to inhibit your body, you got faster with that, with the task, with the coming towards.
Which bit is which was the mind one?
When you said like the exercise you just did, you said to pause in the position you're already in.
Yes, I'm enjoying hearing your observation of that. I think I would slightly argue with it, because the main point for me is that we are embodied mind. So it isn't possible to separate those. That reaction response is a global thing. But I kind of think sometimes you can use it like that. You go, okay, maybe you could see it more that in some contexts, inhibiting the pattern actually means more action. because the pattern might be a sort of freezing. It's like, whoa, let it go. Sorry, Charlie was next, I think.
I know, just so there was a couple of things. I don't know if I can be very articulate. I really, I mean, I know that you were picking this out in my class, but I enjoyed this kind of idea of the inhibition of stopping somehow. I liked that idea that this kind of, you know, the idea of inhibition might feel like something which is about resting or whatever, but actually it doesn't necessarily mean it's a holding, but it's actually potentially, the inhibition is actually about inhibiting stopping flow, for instance, or allowing attention to move, and that also relates to something about this thing, maybe something you were saying about closing the eyes and feeling sadness or whatever, but this sense of what's happening in some of this work seems to be about the attention and about movement and about letting the movement also happen, moving with your attention, so that yes, the sadness comes and then goes and then something. All of the things can be there in this passage of time, but there was something really nice about something that's happening in what you were saying that seemed to be about that. All these things are going on. And,
inclusive awareness
yes.
is another way of putting it. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
I think Lucas was slightly before.
Okay.
No, I was just a bit confused about this inhibition thing. Because yesterday there was this moment when I had this feeling of like, oh my god, how much is going on? Like there was a small dance here going on, but then I choose to stay out. And I just have the feeling sometimes it's also good to, like, sometimes it's helpful for me to let myself like dive into something which is happening in me, which one could also call getting lost in it, but which was feeling to me like giving into it rather than staying with the habit of like, no, like let something of the outside in and stay connected to the world, balance the outside inside thing.
Well, I think for me, key in what you've said is the choosing. If you choose, then that's
exactly, because like I think the habit was there,
exactly
staying with the outside inside balance, and it was kind of like, or sometimes I'm putting pressure on myself, obviously, in that, rather than just saying, okay, it's just a bit much now, lie down for 20 minutes and then you see where you come out afterwards.
So there's and it's interesting, I think as you're saying it, you're realizing you put pressure on yourself, or you're looking for what was the right choice, which we're trained to do. It's like, actually, the thing you chose, that was it, that's it. And it's another aspect for me of what's really helpful, is to go, I'm choosing to do this. And tell your whole system, your body mind, that if you're in resistance, or some part of you is in resistance, go, no, come along with consent. That was what that whole exercise I did was about. How can you consciously consent? And it sort of sounds like what you did. It's like, okay, I want to dive somewhere.
Yeah, or also choosing to not to do what I, in many parts of my life, experience as something helpful.
Exactly.
Like in many situations I have the experience that it's helpful for me to do like this, blah, blah, blah. Not like, maybe not letting myself dry down, blah, blah, blah. But then maybe in some certain moments it's also, so this adjustability to the situation is maybe also.
It's interesting that all these comments quite are related to the this thing of inhibition. But that thing when you told us to sort of sit still for 5 seconds. For me, always immediately when I have to do that, I start to feel uncomfortable almost instantaneously. I don't know if that's got something to do with my dyspraxia or what, but like immediately that I have to sit still, I'm like.
I don't think it's just, I don't know how many other people, I mean, me too, that for me is what's really interesting. It's like, why do we let ourselves, with all the wisdom we have about movement, be in a place, I think it's awareness of it, not...
See, I had that same thing, I was like, is it just because like my attention is has been, like, is focused in on that I'm aware that I'm uncomfortable, or is it something to do with, because even in social situations, immediately that there's like a way we're all supposed to be, I'm already starting to try and sort of fight against it. I don't know whether it's the same thing.
So you might try the same thing about I'm choosing to do this.
Yeah.
Something about the system, bringing all of yourself along. Or and if you're not choosing to do it, I'm choosing to do this, and then it's quite weird. You go, why did I be choosing to do this? I sort of got this from a young woman actually, came for an Alexander lesson on her own, and she was like 15. She was doing it. I said, could you stand still for a moment? She went, and then she changed again, and then she changed, and she said, so I said, why are you moving? She said, because it's all uncomfortable. And that's true. If you're there, your body go, oh no, no. I mean, it's because it's uncomfortable. And I think there's another thing for people who love to move, because I've seen it with a lot of dancers and myself, that sort of how we know we're here by movement. So when we take away that feedback, we get got to feel myself and feel all my things doing what they can do. And that ability to not do stuff is quite, and I learned that recently, it's pretty advanced in the brain, so you don't see a child, and you shouldn't see a child still, actually, but we learn it. That's why it's a spiritual aspiration. Meditation, you sit there, you don't fidget, and it's apparently to do with the brain, really, people know that. But
Apparently to do with
something in the brain, and it being a very adult and learned thing, stillness for us as people, but as dancers we don't like it much. So I think it may be both. It may be the being told what to do, because there's a lot of us that resists that.
Time for just one last
Yeah.
question.
Maybe I'm stumbling in my mind and in what I'm researching as well, but I wonder about the conscious, the term conscious, and from what you're describing or examples that I'm thinking also, it's as if that this process happens as a preparatory process for action. So it's like a stepping outside of action. So if you notice something, you may want to pause and consciously make a decision not to do it. So I wonder, like in situations of kind of full-on action, whether that process of inhibition becomes this conscious. So we're talking also about.
Yes, and there's a whole, I thought we were going to talk about, there's libraries on consciousness studies, and whether I've used the word accurately, because, conscious beings, conscious things, you don't have to have that frontal thing. But the questions I understand it is, does it become less conscious and more? And yes, I think it's something about practice. I mean, people put this differently, but you called the conference thinking touch. Alexander, a real phrase that's come through is what you're looking for is thinking inactivity. And if I'm working with a runner or someone, especially in classical music, which I know nothing about, but I work with people a lot in, where you've got very particular demands and very particular speeds, you can't be putting in pauses. But that's what I meant about invite you in classes of different things to find how do we practice this? Like anything else, it's a skill to practice. And then when you've practiced it, it happens for me, in the activity, which is what we can do separately or on your own, is key for me in this question of what do I think of as a good dance when I watch it or when I'm in it. I don't know how to put words on it, and I failed in your thing, but it's something about the inhibitory, something about the non-doing dancing Something about a dance that is happening that people are totally conscious of, but sometimes it's reflex. So they're aware of their reflexes kicking in. Sometimes it's falling all over the place. Sometimes it's slow. So it's not about that kind of measure, but it's something about being allowed. And so I think both. I think you do it in activity, but to start with and in training, and we're training attention in Ingrid's work. It's like, and those were the other quote. There might be one in there of Danny Lepkoff, who writes quite a lot about the attention and how you're training it in a way, or what you're doing with it. It's like, how in there do we practice this thing so that when we come to play the music or do the dance, it's in there. Yeah, thank you.
So we're just running about 15 minutes behind schedule. So I propose people who want to get coffee can do that upstairs. Just tell them you're with the Dance Studies Conference and they'll add it to a bill. And we'll start at, we're about 20 minutes behind schedule, but we'll start at 35 past. So sharp, so if you hear.
Sorry, I was went to catch us up. I stopped being able to see the clock.
It was too good for me to stop it.
But that's going to be, look, we've got 3.
We have